Welcome home, darling. That's the first thing my mother said to me when I stepped through the mahogany doors of the Smith estate. I'm Dr. Liza Smith, 31 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've been running from this house like my life depended on it. Turns out, it actually did. The Pacific Heights mansion gleamed under the afternoon sun, its Victorian facade pristine as always. Catherine Smith had spared no expense for my father's memorial service. White roses cascaded down marble steps, and servers in crisp uniforms moved like choreographed dancers through rooms that had witnessed 3 generations of Smith family secrets. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, catered hors d'oeuvres, and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic that made my stomach turn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'd flown in from my lab in Geneva just 12 hours ago, my body still humming with jet lag and grief I hadn't allowed myself to process. Dad had been dead for 2 weeks before Catherine even bothered to call me. "I didn't want to interrupt your important work," she'd said, her voice carrying that familiar note of condescension wrapped in silk. Now, watching her glide through the crowd in her perfectly tailored black Chanel, I wondered how I'd ever thought she loved me. "Daniel! Oh my God, look at you!" Daniel, my younger brother, approached with arms outstretched and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. At 28, he'd grown soft around the edges, his once athletic frame now cushioned by years of trust fund comfort. His embrace felt performative, like everything else in this house. "Daniel," I kept my voice neutral, professional. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Our loss," he corrected, but something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe? Fear? "Mom's been so broken up about Dad. She really needed you here." I glanced over his shoulder to where Catherine held court near the grand piano, accepting condolences with the grace of a practiced actress. She caught my eye and smiled, the kind of smile that used to make me feel like I was drowning in shallow water. That's when the first wave hit me. Dizziness, subtle at first, like the ground had shifted an inch to the left. I pressed my palm against the cool marble of the foyer wall, attributing it to exhaustion. Grief did strange things to the body. I'd seen it in my research. Stress-induced chemical imbalances, disrupted sleep patterns affecting neurological function. "You look pale," Grace Morrison appeared beside me, her weathered hands carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes. She'd been with our family for 20 years, a quiet presence who'd watched me grow from angry teenager to internationally recognized toxicologist. Now in her 60s, she moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to become invisible in plain sight. "Dr. Smith, a colleague of my father's, materialized with outstretched hand. Robert spoke of you constantly. So proud of your work with exotic compounds. Heard you just published something groundbreaking on antidote synthesis?" "In the Journal of Advanced Toxicology," I confirmed, accepting the handshake. "Novel approaches to neutralizing synthetic biotoxins." "Fascinating field. Must require incredible precision." "Precision saves lives," I said, the familiar comfort of shop talk grounding me momentarily. One molecule out of place and another wave of nausea rolled through me, stronger this time. My hands trembled as I reached for one of Grace's champagne flutes, hoping the bubbles might settle my stomach. "Are you quite all right, dear?" Catherine appeared at my elbow with the silent grace she'd perfected over decades of social maneuvering. Up close, I could see the careful artistry of her makeup, the way she'd contoured away the signs of grief, or perhaps the absence of it. "Fine," I lied, taking a sip of champagne. The bubbles felt wrong, somehow. Heavier than they should be, with an aftertaste that reminded me of copper pennies. Just need to eat something. "Of course, you always were sensitive." Her voice carried that particular brand of concern that had always made me feel defective rather than cared for. "Grace, do make sure Liza gets some of those little salmon canapes. She's looking positively green." As Catherine glided away to charm another cluster of mourners, I caught Grace watching me again. This time, her expression was unmistakable. Fear. The evening wore on with painful formality. I found myself relegated to conversations about my father's research, his brilliant contributions to pharmaceutical chemistry, his tragic early death from what the doctors had called a rare autoimmune disorder. Nobody mentioned how he deteriorated so rapidly, how his symptoms were inconsistent with any known condition. Nobody mentioned how I'd been too busy building my career to visit in his final months. By 9 o'clock, the last guests were filtering out into the San Francisco night, leaving behind the detritus of polite grief. Lipstick-stained glasses, crumpled napkins, and the lingering scent of forced sympathy. My symptoms had worsened throughout the evening. Trembling hands, difficulty focusing, a metallic taste that no amount of champagne could wash away. "You're staying the night, of course," Catherine announced as Grace began clearing glasses. "It wasn't a question. Your old room is exactly as you left it." "I have a hotel."
Nonsense. You're a family. The word sounded strange in her mouth, like a foreign language she'd never quite mastered. Besides, you look dreadful, much too unsteady to drive. She was right, though I hated admitting it. The dizziness had evolved into something more serious, vertigo that made the Persian rugs beneath my feet feel like a ship's deck in rough seas. "Just for tonight," I conceded, handing my keys to Daniel. My childhood bedroom waited like a museum exhibit to the person I used to be. Catherine had preserved it exactly: the twin bed with its navy comforter, the shelves lined with chemistry textbooks and academic awards, the window overlooking the garden where Dad used to test his experimental compounds on willing plant subjects. I sat heavily on the bed, pressing my palms against my temples as the room spun gently around me. This wasn't jet lag. This wasn't grief. This was something else entirely, something that made my professional instincts prickle with unease. Pulling out my phone, I opened the voice memo app and began documenting symptoms the way I'd been trained. Day 1, approximately 10:30 p.m., experiencing vertigo, nausea, fine motor tremors in both hands, metallic taste persisting for approximately 4 hours. Onset began roughly 30 minutes after arrival at... I paused, staring at the screen. After arrival at what? My childhood home? My father's memorial? Or after that first sip of champagne from Grace's tray? The thought hit me like ice water. I was a toxicologist. I'd spent 15 years studying how poisons moved through the human body, how they disguised themselves as natural illness, how they could be delivered in doses so small they'd escape detection by all but the most sophisticated tests. And I was experiencing textbook symptoms of acute poisoning. My hands shook as I saved the voice memo and opened my contacts. Benjamin Hayes, my research partner, would be asleep in Geneva, but this couldn't wait. Something was wrong, desperately, dangerously wrong, and I was alone in a house where my father had died of mysterious symptoms that no doctor had been able to explain. Outside my window, the garden lay in shadow, and I could swear I saw a figure moving between the roses, watching, waiting. The memorial service was over, but I was beginning to suspect that whatever had killed my father was just getting started with me. The official cause of death was listed as autoimmune hepatitis, leading to liver failure, but Dad's liver enzymes in the months before his death showed a pattern I recognized from my research on synthetic biotoxins: a gradual escalation followed by sudden, catastrophic failure. More troubling, his symptoms had included neurological manifestations that weren't consistent with liver disease: tremors, confusion, and in his final weeks, progressive paralysis. I was photographing the medical records with my phone when footsteps in the hallway made me freeze. Heavy, deliberate, not Catherine's light step or Grace's careful shuffle. Daniel. "Liza, what are you doing in here?" I looked up to find my brother in the doorway, his expression caught between concern and something that looked suspiciously like guilt.
He was fully dressed despite the early hour, as if he'd been awake for some time. Going through Dad's medical files, there are some inconsistencies I want to understand. Inconsistencies? What kind of inconsistencies? His symptom progression doesn't match the official diagnosis. Look at these enzyme levels. I gestured to the spread of papers, but Daniel didn't move closer to examine them. Liza, you can't keep doing this. Dad's gone. Picking apart his medical records won't bring him back. This isn't about bringing him back. It's about understanding what really killed him. What really? Daniel's voice cracked slightly. He had an autoimmune condition. The doctors explained everything. Did they explain the neurological symptoms, the paralysis, the way his white blood cell count fluctuated? I stood, gathering the papers protectively. Daniel, I think Dad was poisoned. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. That's insane. Who would want to hurt Dad? Everyone loved him. Not everyone. The truth hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Catherine inherited everything when he died. The pharmaceutical company, the patents for his research, the estate, all of it. She's our mother, Liza. She loved Dad. Did she? Or did she love what he represented? His brilliance, his success, his connections. I moved toward the desk where Dad's laptop sat closed. I need to check his research files. If someone was poisoning him, there might be records. Stop! Daniel's voice was sharp, almost panicked. Just stop. You're talking about conspiracy theories, about murder. Do you hear how crazy that sounds? I studied my brother's face, noting the sweat beading at his hairline despite the cool morning air, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Fear radiated from him in waves. But fear of what? The truth? Or the consequences of that truth being discovered? Danny, I used his childhood nickname deliberately. What aren't you telling me? For a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw the scared little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Then his expression hardened again. I'm telling you to leave it alone. Dad's gone. Digging up conspiracy theories won't change anything except to hurt Mom more than she's already hurting. Before I could respond, he was gone, leaving me alone with my father's medical records and a growing certainty that my family was harboring secrets that went far deeper than simple grief. I spent the next hour photographing everything: medical records, research notes, even Dad's appointment calendar from the months before his death. Then I carefully returned everything to its proper place, leaving no trace of my investigation. Back in my room, I called Benjamin. Liza, Christ, what time is it there? His voice was thick with sleep, but concern quickly sharpened his tone when I explained my symptoms. You need to get to a hospital immediately. What you're describing sounds like acute poisoning. I know. But Ben, I need you to do something first. I'm sending you photos of my father's medical records. Run them against your database of synthetic toxin profiles. Liza! Please, just do it. And Ben, pack your emergency kit. I think I'm going to need your help. After hanging up, I locked my door and began preparing for what I was increasingly certain would be a battle for my life. Using the portable testing kit I always traveled with, a habit that seemed paranoid until now, I analyzed the tea sample. What I found made my hands shake for reasons that had nothing to do with poisoning. The tea contained traces of a synthetic compound I recognized from my own research, a slow-acting neurotoxin that caused progressive organ failure while mimicking natural disease. It was virtually undetectable unless you knew exactly what to look for. And, according to my analysis, I'd been ingesting small doses of it for at least the past 18 hours. Someone in this house was systematically poisoning me just as they'd poisoned my father. And unless I could figure out who and why, I had perhaps days before my organs began shutting down permanently. Outside my window, the San Francisco fog rolled in from the bay like a gray shroud, obscuring the garden where Dad used to test his compounds. Somewhere in this house, someone was watching, waiting, calculating the perfect dose to make my death look as natural as his had. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd chosen to poison a toxicologist. Now it was my turn to play chemist, and this time I was experimenting on someone else's timeline. Benjamin arrived at 2 p.m. sharp, carrying 2 suitcases and wearing the grim expression of a man who'd spent 6 hours on international flights reviewing medical records that confirmed his worst fears.
"Show me the analysis," he said without preamble, following me up the servants' staircase to my room. Benjamin Hayes had been my research partner for 8 years, and I'd never seen him this focused, this professionally frightened. I locked the door and pulled out my portable spectrometer, a device about the size of a hardcover book that had cost more than most people's cars. Within minutes, we had confirmation of what I'd suspected. The tea contained compound X47, a synthetic neurotoxin developed by Neurochem Industries in the 1990s as part of a classified military research program. Jesus Christ, Liza. Benjamin stared at the readout, his face pale. This stuff was banned after animal trials. It causes progressive neurological degeneration, organ failure, and death within 2 to 4 weeks, depending on dosage. And it's virtually undetectable in standard toxicology screenings, I added grimly, perfect for murder disguised as natural causes. Benjamin pulled up files on his laptop, research papers, classified documents he'd somehow accessed through his university connections. Neurochem Industries discontinued X47 research in 1997 after congressional hearings. All samples were supposed to be destroyed. Supposed to be. I leaned over his shoulder reading the technical specifications. But Catherine's pharmaceutical company, Smith Meridian, acquired several Neurochem assets in 1998, including research facilities, equipment, and, I traced my finger down the acquisition list, stored chemical compounds. The implications hit us both simultaneously. Catherine hadn't just inherited a pharmaceutical fortune, she'd inherited an arsenal of experimental toxins, including the one that was currently destroying my nervous system. "We need to get you to a hospital," Benjamin said, already packing his equipment. "Immediate chelation therapy, supportive care." "No!" I grabbed his arm. "Not yet. Bun, look at Dad's symptom progression." I pulled out my phone, showing him the photos of medical records. First dose to death, approximately 14 weeks. I've been exposed for less than 24 hours. We have time. Time for what? To synthesize an antidote. I moved to my father's desk, pulling out research notebooks I'd found hidden behind his medical texts. Dad was working on neutralizing agents for synthetic biotoxins. Look at this. Benjamin examined the notebooks, his eyes widening as he read my father's careful notations. He knew. Somehow he figured out what was happening to him and tried to develop a counteragent. But he ran out of time. I pointed to the final entries, dated just days before my father's death. He was close, Ben, really close, but the neurological symptoms were too advanced for him to complete the work. And you think you can finish what he started? I know I can. The question is whether I can do it before the compound reaches critical concentration in my system. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, studying my father's research with the same intensity I'd seen him bring to our most challenging cases. Finally, he nodded. "We'll need a proper lab. Your hotel room won't cut it for this level of synthesis. There's a private research facility about 20 minutes from here. I still have access for my undergraduate work at UCSF. I was already gathering my father's notebooks, my testing equipment, everything we'd need. Catherine thinks I'm taking a nap to recover from travel exhaustion. We have maybe 4 hours before she expects to see me again. 4 hours to synthesize a compound that hasn't been successfully created in 30 years of research. No pressure." As we prepared to leave, Grace Morrison appeared in the hallway with her usual silent efficiency.
But instead of pretending she hadn't seen us, she stepped directly into our path. "You figured it out," she said quietly. Her accent carried traces of the El Salvador she had left behind decades ago. "About the tea. About what's been happening." Benjamin tensed beside me, but I held up my hand. Something in Grace's eyes told me she wasn't a threat. She was an ally who'd been waiting 20 years for someone to piece together the truth. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Since your father started getting sick. Mrs. Catherine, she would prepare his coffee herself every morning, bring it to him in the study. Said it was a special blend, something to help his research focus. But I saw her adding things, powders from little vials she kept locked in her jewelry box." "Why didn't you say anything?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. Who would believe the housekeeper over Mrs. Catherine? And my immigration status, she reminded me often that I could disappear very easily if I caused problems. Benjamin and I exchanged glances, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "Grace," I said carefully, "I need you to keep Catherine away from my room for the next few hours. Tell her I'm sleeping, that I shouldn't be disturbed. Can you do that?" She nodded firmly. "Dr. Smith was a good man. He didn't deserve what she did to him. And you?" She looked at me with fierce protectiveness. "You have your father's eyes, his determination. If anyone can stop her, it's you." The UCSF research facility hummed with the quiet efficiency of advanced science. Using my father's notes as a guide, Benjamin and I began the delicate process of synthesizing a neutralizing agent for X47. The work required absolute precision. One miscalculation could result in a compound more deadly than the original poison. "Molecular weight 847.3. I called out, adjusting the spectrometer while Benjamin handled the chemical synthesis. "Binding affinity for neural receptors showing optimal parameters." "pH stabilizing at 7.2, he responded, his hands steady despite the pressure. "Temperature holding at -15 Celsius.
Hours passed in a blur of careful chemistry. We worked with the rhythm of partners who'd spent years perfecting their collaboration, but the urgency was unlike anything we'd faced before. Every few minutes, I checked my symptoms, still manageable, but the tremors in my hands were worsening, and the metallic taste had evolved into something that reminded me, ominously, of copper wire. "Last synthesis step," Benjamin announced at 6:30 p.m. "If your father's calculations are correct, this should bind directly to the X47 molecules and neutralize them before they can cause permanent neurological damage." I watched the final chemical reaction through the observation window, holding my breath as two clear solutions combined and gradually turned a pale blue. According to my father's notes, blue meant success. Any other color meant we'd created something potentially more dangerous than the poison itself. "Blue," Benjamin breathed. "It's actually blue." But as I prepared to test the antidote on a blood sample containing X47, my phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "She knows you're gone. Coming to find you. Hurry." Catherine had discovered my absence, which meant our window of safety was closing rapidly. More troubling, it meant she'd escalated the tie line for whatever she had planned. "Ben, we need to go now." I carefully packaged the antidote in a temperature-controlled container while he gathered our equipment. "But first, I need to call Detective Torres." "Detective Torres?" "Dad's death was never properly investigated. If I'm right about what's been happening, Catherine has committed murder, and if we don't stop her tonight, she's going to try to finish what she started." As we raced back toward Pacific Heights through the gathering San Francisco dusk, I called the number Detective Amanda Torres had given me 3 years ago when I'd first questioned the circumstances of my father's death. She'd been the only law enforcement officer willing to listen to my concerns, though she'd lacked evidence to pursue an investigation. Now, I had evidence. And more importantly, I had proof that Catherine was actively continuing her pattern of murder. The question was whether we'd make it back to the house before she realized exactly how much I'd discovered. Because if Catherine knew I could identify the poison, synthesize an antidote, and prove her guilt, she wouldn't wait for the X47 to kill me slowly. She'd find a much faster way to ensure my silence permanently.
The fog was rolling in from the bay as we pulled up to the Smith estate, turning the familiar mansion into something that looked like a Gothic nightmare. Every window blazed with light, and I could see figures moving behind the curtains. Catherine was no longer bothering with subtlety. The endgame had begun. Detective Amanda Torres looked exactly the same as she had 3 years ago. Sharp eyes, graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of focused intensity that made guilty people confess things they'd never intended to reveal. We met at a 24-hour diner in the Mission District, far from Pacific Heights and Catherine's watchful eyes. She said without preamble, sliding a thick manila folder across the scarred formica table, "I've been waiting for this call. Your father's case has been sitting on my desk for years, officially closed, but never forgotten." I opened the folder to find photographs, financial records, witness statements, the accumulated evidence of someone who'd never believed the official story. Torres had been building a case against Catherine, piece by careful piece, waiting for the smoking gun that would make it all stick. "Your financial records show Catherine was hemorrhaging money before your father's death," Torres explained, pointing to bank statements highlighted in yellow. "The pharmaceutical company was failing. Patents were expiring. She was facing bankruptcy within 18 months. But my dad's death changed everything. Everything. She inherited his research, his patents, and a life insurance policy worth $12 million. Torres pulled out another document. "Your brother's been helping her," she said quietly, probably without realizing it. "Financial records show payments to a private investigation firm. They've been monitoring your communications, your travel, your research publications. Catherine knew you were getting close to something." My blood chilled. How close? Close enough that she accelerated her timeline. The memorial service wasn't about grief, Liza. It was about getting you back to San Francisco where she could control the situation. Torres reached into her jacket and pulled out a recording device. "I need you to wear this tonight. Get her to confess. Get her to admit what she did to your father and what she's trying to do to you." "You want me to go back there, knowing what I know? You're the only one who can get close enough. She thinks she's still in control, still manipulating the situation. Use that." Torres leaned forward, her voice urgent. "But Liza, if anything goes wrong, if you feel unsafe for even a second, you get out. We'll be monitoring from a van parked 2 blocks away." I stared at the recording device, small enough to hide in my jewelry, but powerful enough to capture a confession that would put Catherine away for life. The logical part of my brain screamed that this was insane, that I should run as far from San Francisco as possible and never look back. But the daughter in me, the one who'd spent 15 years wondering if she could have saved her father, knew I had to see this through. "There's something else," Torres said as I clipped the recorder inside my watch band. "Catherine's been in contact with someone at Neurochem Industries. Phone records show multiple calls in the weeks before your arrival. We think she's been getting advice on dosage, timing, maybe even acquiring more compounds." The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about inheritance money or covering up past crimes. Catherine was actively expanding her operations, potentially targeting other people who threatened her carefully constructed empire. Who else is she planning to hurt? We don't know yet, but we're going to find out tonight. Grace Morrison was waiting for me in the kitchen when I returned to the estate at 9 p.m. Her hands shook as she dried dishes that were already clean, and her eyes darted nervously toward the doorway every few seconds. "She's been asking for you," Grace whispered. "Wants to know where you went, who you talked to. I told her you were visiting your father's grave, but she didn't believe me. Grace, I need you to tell me everything, starting from the beginning." She set down the dish towel and looked at me with eyes that held 20 years of accumulated fear and guilt. "It started about 6 months before your father died. Mrs. Catherine, she began taking an interest in his research that she'd never shown before, asking questions about his work, his schedules, his eating habits. His eating habits? She wanted to know everything. When he drank coffee, what he liked for breakfast, whether he took vitamins or supplements. She said she wanted to be a better wife, more supportive of his career." Grace's voice dropped to barely audible. But I saw her in his study, late at night, going through his files, copying things. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Taurus needed to hear this. Then she started preparing his food herself. Every morning she'd make his coffee with her own hands, bring it to him in the study. He was so touched by the gesture, said it reminded him of when they were newlyweds. Grace's voice broke. He never suspected. Why would he? She was his wife. Tell me about the powders. Small glass vials, kept in a locked box in her jewelry cabinet. She thought I didn't notice, but I clean that room every day. The vials had labels with numbers and letters, scientific names I couldn't read. She'd add just a tiny amount to his coffee, measuring it out with a little silver spoon like she was seasoning soup. Grace reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small manila envelope. I saved one of the empty vials. I knew it was wrong, what she was doing, but I was so scared. If she could poison her own husband... The vial was smaller than my thumb, with traces of white powder still clinging to the glass. The label read, X47B, experimental, in neat typewritten letters. Grace, you could have died keeping this evidence. Your father was a good man. He treated me like family, not like help. When I saw him getting sicker, saw her pretending to be worried while she was the one... Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I couldn't save him, but maybe I can help you stop her. There's more, isn't there? Grace nodded reluctantly. After your father died, she didn't throw away the vials. She kept them, locked them in a new hiding place. And when you called to say you were coming for the memorial, Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. She took them out again. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Catherine's heels clicking across marble floors somewhere in the house. She was coming, drawn by some predatory instinct that told her we were discussing things she needed to control. Grace, tomorrow morning I want you to pack a bag and go stay with relatives. Don't tell Catherine where you're going. What about you? I'm going to finish what my father started. Catherine's footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the false brightness of her voice calling my name. Grace swept my hand once, then melted away through the servants' passage with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd survived 20 years in this house by knowing when to disappear. I slipped the vial into my pocket and turned to face the woman who'd murdered my father and was systematically trying to murder me. Time to see if 20 years of keeping secrets had made Catherine sloppy, or if she was still the calculating predator who'd fooled everyone for so long. There you are, darling. Catherine swept into the kitchen like she owned every molecule of air in the room, which technically she did. I've been looking everywhere for you. Grace said you went to visit your father's grave, but I called the cemetery. They haven't seen you. I met her gaze steadily, my hand resting casually over the recording device hidden in my watch band. I went for a drive. Needed to think. About what? About Dad? About his death? About some inconsistencies I found in his medical records. Something flickered behind Catherine's perfectly composed expression, a brief tightening around her eyes that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years studying the microexpressions of people hiding deadly secrets. Inconsistencies? Her voice carried just the right note of concerned confusion. What kind of inconsistencies? Let's discuss it in the study. More private there. She followed me through the house, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the marble floors. In the study, surrounded by portraits of 3 generations of Smith family patriarchs, I spread my father's medical files across his mahogany desk. Dad's liver enzymes, I began, pointing to the lab results. The pattern of elevation and decline doesn't match autoimmune hepatitis. It matches synthetic biotoxin exposure. Catherine moved closer, studying the papers with an expression of perfect maternal concern. I don't understand. Are you saying the doctors misdiagnosed him? I'm saying someone poisoned him. slowly, methodically, over a period of months, using a compound called X47 that was developed by Neurochem Industries in the 1990s. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Catherine's face remained composed, but I saw her hands clench slightly at her sides. "That's a very serious accusation, Liza. Do you have any evidence to support such a theory?" I pulled out the vial Grace had given me, setting it carefully on the desk between us. X47B, experimental. Recognize it? Catherine stared at the vial for a long moment, and when she looked up, her mask had finally slipped. The concerned mother was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Where did you get that?" "Doesn't matter. What matters is that I know what it is, where it came from, and what you've been using it for." "You don't know anything." Her voice was different now, sharper, more focused. "You're a child playing with things you don't understand." "I understand enough. I understand that Smith Meridian acquired Neurochem's research assets in 1998, including stored samples of experimental compounds. I understand that you've been facing financial ruin, and I understand that my father's death solved both problems very conveniently." Catherine laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your father was a brilliant man, but he was also naive. He actually thought he could expose what he called questionable research practices without consequences. He thought his reputation would protect him. So you killed him." "I saved our family's legacy. Everything we built, everything we achieved, he would have destroyed it all for the sake of his precious ethics." She moved around the desk, backing me toward the window, "just like you're trying to do now." "And me? What's your excuse for poisoning me?" "You've spent 15 years turning yourself into a weapon against this family. Your research, your expertise. It was only a matter of time before you figured out what happened to your father. I couldn't let that happen." The confession was better than anything Torres could have hoped for. But Catherine wasn't finished. "You want to know the truth, Liza? Your father discovered what I was doing 3 weeks before he died. He tried to synthesize an antidote, working frantically in that little lab of his. But the neurological damage was too advanced. His hands shook so badly he couldn't handle the equipment properly." Horror washed over me as I understood what she was saying. He knew. In those final weeks, he knew you were killing him. And he never said a word, never accused me, never went to the police. He just worked quietly on his pathetic attempt to save himself. Catherine's smile was radiant with malice. "He loved me too much to destroy me, even to save his own life. Such a romantic, your father." Rage built in my chest like a physical force, but I kept my voice steady. "And now you're trying to kill me the same way?" "Oh no, darling. I learned from my mistakes with your father. You're much too smart, much too suspicious. You won't get weeks to work on antidotes." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a syringe filled with clear liquid. "This is X47 in concentrated form. 1 injection and you'll be dead within minutes. No time for clever chemistry, no opportunity for last-minute heroics." Catherine raised the syringe, her face transformed by years of suppressed hatred and jealousy. "You always thought you were so much smarter than everyone else. Let's see how smart you feel when—" The struggle was brief but violent. Catherine lunged forward with the syringe. I grabbed her wrist, trying to force the needle away from my throat. We crashed into the desk, scattering papers and sending the antique lamp crashing to the floor. In the chaos, Catherine's grip on the syringe slipped. The needle, still filled with concentrated X47, plunged deep into her own forearm. She stared at the empty syringe in shock, then at me with an expression of pure disbelief. "You," she whispered, then collapsed. The woman who had murdered my father and tried to murder me was dying from her own poison. And in approximately 15 minutes, I would be the only person in the world with the knowledge to save her life. The irony was almost perfect. Almost. Catherine convulsed on the Persian rug, her perfectly manicured fingers clawing at her throat as the concentrated X47 coursed through her bloodstream.
The same poison that had killed my father, that she'd been using to slowly murder me, was now destroying her nervous system at an exponential rate. "Help! Help me!" she gasped, her eyes wide with terror and disbelief. I knelt beside her, my medical training overriding 15 years of anger and grief. Her pulse was rapid and thready, pupils dilated, skin growing pale as her circulatory system began shutting down. In concentrated form, X47 was merciless, complete organ failure within 20 minutes unless neutralized immediately. "Liza!" Benjamin burst through the study door, followed by Detective Torres and 2 paramedics. He took one look at Catherine's condition and understood immediately. Jesus! How much did she get? Full syringe, concentrated solution. Maybe 15, 20 times the lethal dose.
The paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, starting IV lines, preparing to transport. But I could see the confusion in their eyes as they tried to identify the toxin, tried to understand what treatment protocols to follow. "Doctor," the lead paramedic looked up at me urgently, "we need to know what we're dealing with. What's the antidote?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Everyone in the room knew the answer. I was the only person who possessed the knowledge to synthesize the neutralizing agent for X47. Benjamin and I had spent hours creating it just that afternoon, and it was currently locked in a temperature-controlled case in my hotel room. "There is an antidote," I said quietly. "I can synthesize it, but it takes time." "How much time?" Torres asked. 2 hours minimum, maybe 3 to be safe. Benjamin checked his watch. "She's got maybe 15 minutes before the neurological damage becomes irreversible, 20 minutes before cardiac arrest." Dr. Jonathan Reed, the hospital's chief of staff, arrived with his own team of specialists. He quickly assessed the situation, a woman dying from an exotic poison with only one person in the world capable of saving her life. "Dr. Smith," he said formally, "I'm requesting your immediate assistance in treating this patient. We'll provide full laboratory facilities, any equipment you need." But even as he spoke, I could see the questions in his eyes. This wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a moral crucible that would define who I was as both a doctor and a human being. "She murdered my father," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos around me. "She's been systematically poisoning me for the past 2 days. She just confessed to multiple murders and attempted to inject me with the same toxin that's killing her now." Reed's expression didn't change. "And yet, you're the only one who can save her life." "That's correct." The silence stretched impossibly long. Catherine's breathing grew more labored, her body fighting a battle it couldn't win without intervention. Daniel appeared in the doorway, took one look at our mother convulsing on the floor, and went white. "What happened? What's wrong with her?" "She poisoned herself," Torres said bluntly, "with the same compound she used to kill your father and attempt to kill your sister." Daniel stared at me with desperate, pleading eyes. "Liza, you have to help her. Whatever she did, whatever happened, she's still our mother." "Is she?" I looked down at Catherine, remembering her whispered confessions, her casual cruelty, her complete lack of remorse for destroying the man who'd loved her unconditionally. Benjamin touched my arm gently. "Liza, the choice is yours. No one else can make it." I made my decision in the ambulance, watching Catherine fight for each breath while machines monitored her failing vital signs. Not because I'd forgiven her, not because I believed she deserved salvation, but because saving her was the only way to ensure she faced justice for what she'd done. Dead women don't stand trial. Dead women don't spend decades in prison contemplating their crimes. Dead women don't suffer the way their victims suffered. "Get me to UCSF Medical," I told the driver, "and call ahead. I need a fully equipped laboratory ready in 15 minutes. Benjamin squeezed my hand. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure about a lot of things," I replied, watching Catherine's pulse rate spike dangerously on the monitor. "I'm sure she killed my father. I'm sure she tried to kill me. And I'm sure that letting her die would make me complicit in her crimes rather than the solution to them." The laboratory at UCSF hummed with emergency activity as teams of technicians prepared equipment for the most critical synthesis of my career. Catherine was transferred to the ICU, her condition deteriorating by the minute, while I worked with methodical precision to recreate the antidote Benjamin and I had developed. Molecular structure stabilizing, I called out, adjusting the centrifuge while monitoring the chemical reaction. pH balanced at 7.2, temperature holding steady. Dr. Reed observed from the viewing window, his expression grave. Time remaining? 4 minutes until complete organ failure becomes irreversible, Benjamin answered, his eyes fixed on the readouts. Synthesis completion in approximately 3 minutes. The final step required absolute precision, combining 2 highly volatile compounds in exact proportions while maintaining perfect temperature control. 1 degree too high and the antidote would become useless. 1 molecule out of balance and it could accelerate Catherine's death rather than prevent it. Now, I whispered, watching the solution turn the telltale blue that indicated successful neutralization. We rushed the antidote to Catherine's ICU room, where machines beeped urgently around her unconscious form. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and her breathing was so shallow it barely registered on the monitors. IV push 20 milliliters, I instructed the nurse, drawing the antidote into a syringe with steady hands, followed by continuous drip at 5 milliliters per hour. The effect was almost immediate. Catherine's heart rate stabilized, her breathing deepened, and color began to return to her cheeks. The machines around her bed shifted from urgent alarms to steady, rhythmic beeps that announced life restored rather than life ending. Will she recover completely? Reed asked. Physically, yes. Some temporary neurological effects, possible memory gaps around the time of exposure, but no permanent damage. I set down the empty syringe and looked at the woman who'd tried to destroy me. Mentally and emotionally, that's not my department.
Torres stepped forward, handcuffs glinting in the harsh hospital lighting. When she wakes up, she's under arrest for the murder of Robert Smith and the attempted murder of Dr. Liza Smith. Catherine regained consciousness 6 hours later to find herself handcuffed to a hospital bed, surrounded by police officers and federal agents. The investigation had expanded beyond simple murder charges. Her connection to Neurochem Industries and illegal possession of banned chemical weapons had attracted the attention of multiple law enforcement agencies. "You saved her," Torres observed, watching through the window as Catherine realized the full scope of her situation. "Why?" "Because saving lives is what I do, even when those lives belong to people who don't deserve saving." The media attention was immediate and overwhelming. By morning, news trucks lined the hospital parking lot, and reporters shouted questions about the poison heiress and her toxicologist daughter. The story had everything the public craved: family betrayal, exotic murder weapons, and a moral dilemma with no clear answers. Daniel found me in the hospital cafeteria at dawn, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. "I'm sorry," he said simply, sitting across from me with coffee that neither of us would drink. "I knew something was wrong. I knew, and I let myself be convinced it was nothing. She manipulated you the same way she manipulated Dad, the same way she tried to manipulate me. The difference is, you were still young enough to believe that mothers don't murder their families. How do we move forward from this? How do we rebuild anything from what's left?" I looked through the cafeteria windows at the reporters setting up for their morning broadcasts, at the federal agents coordinating their investigation, at the hospital staff treating Catherine like any other patient despite knowing what she'd done. "We tell the truth," I said finally. "We testify against her. We make sure Dad gets justice, even if it comes 15 years too late." Grace Morrison appeared at our table, carrying a small suitcase and wearing the determined expression of someone who'd finally chosen courage over fear. "I'm going to testify," she announced, "about everything I saw, everything I knew, everything I should have reported years ago." Benjamin joined us with news from the laboratory. The pharmaceutical companies being raided by federal agents. Preliminary findings suggest Catherine wasn't working alone. There's evidence of a larger network involved in illegal weapons research. The scope of Catherine's crimes was expanding with each revelation. But for me, the most important truth had already been established. My father hadn't died of natural causes, and I wasn't going insane from unexplained symptoms. Sometimes the simplest truths are the most profound. That evening, I stood in my father's study one last time, surrounded by his research notes and the family portraits that had witnessed decades of secrets. Tomorrow, I would return to Geneva and my real life, but tonight, I needed to say goodbye to the girl who'd spent 15 years believing she could have saved him if only she'd been smarter, faster, more observant. She couldn't have saved him, but she'd saved herself. And that would have to be enough. 6 months later, I stood in a federal courthouse in downtown San Francisco, my hand raised as I swore to tell the truth about the woman who'd murdered my father and tried to murder me. Catherine sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, her perfect composure finally cracked beyond repair. The woman who had once commanded rooms with her presence now looked small, diminished, ordinary. Dr. Smith, the prosecutor began, his voice echoing in the packed courtroom, in your expert opinion, could the defendant's actions have resulted in death if left untreated? Yes. The concentrated X47 compound would have caused complete organ failure within 20 minutes. Without the antidote I synthesized, Catherine Smith would have died. And yet you chose to save her life. Why? Because justice requires the living. Dead people can't be held accountable for their crimes, can't face the consequences of their choices, can't spend decades reflecting on the pain they've caused. Death would have been an escape for her. This is accountability. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder of Robert Smith, attempted murder of Dr. Liza Smith, illegal possession of banned chemical weapons, and conspiracy to commit murder. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiff led her away in shackles, Catherine turned back once. For a moment, I thought I saw something that might have been remorse in her eyes. Then she was gone, and I was finally free to breathe without wondering if my next meal might be my last. The media circus that followed was intense, but mercifully brief. The poison heiress story captivated headlines for weeks, but public interest eventually moved on to newer scandals. What remained was the work, the real work of rebuilding something meaningful from the wreckage of our family. The Smith estate had been transformed into something Dad would have loved, the Robert Smith Research Foundation, dedicated to developing antidotes for exotic toxins and supporting victims of chemical violence. Walking through what had once been Catherine's showpiece mansion, now converted into laboratories and research facilities, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace.
He would be proud, Daniel said as we toured Dad's old laboratory, now expanded into a state-of-the-art research facility. My brother had changed dramatically over the past months, his soft edges hardened by the reality of what he'd unknowingly enabled, of what you built here, of what you chose to become instead of what she tried to make you. We built this, I corrected, and we're just getting started. Daniel now managed the foundation with the quiet determination of someone seeking redemption through service. He'd testified against Catherine with a courage I'd never seen in him before, finally choosing truth over the comfortable lies that had shaped his life. Grace Morrison had become the foundation's head of operations, her 20 years of silent observation finally channeled into protecting others from the kind of abuse she'd witnessed. No more secrets, she'd told me on her first day in the new role. No more silence when people need help. She'd been instrumental in establishing our victim support program, using her own experience to help families navigate the complex emotions of betrayal by loved ones. Grace understood better than anyone how abuse could flourish in silence, how shame could paralyze victims into complicity. Benjamin and I published our research on X47 neutralization in the New England Journal of Medicine, making the antidote formula freely available to medical facilities worldwide. We'd received requests from hospitals in 43 countries, and our synthesis protocols had already saved 17 lives. We turned her weapon into medicine, Benjamin had observed while reviewing the latest batch of success stories. Her legacy of death became a foundation for life.
The irony wasn't lost on me. Catherine's attempt to destroy me had ultimately led to discoveries that would help countless others. Evil had inadvertently served good, though I knew better than to attribute any moral purpose to her actions. 3 weeks ago, I spoke at the International Conference on Medical Ethics in Geneva, sharing my story with doctors, researchers, and ethicists from around the world. The auditorium was packed, and the question and answer session ran an hour over schedule. The question that came up repeatedly was deceptively simple. How do you forgive someone who tried to kill you? My answer was always the same. I didn't forgive her. I chose to save her anyway. There's a difference. Forgiveness implies absolution, a wiping clean of debts owed. What I'd chosen was something harder and more meaningful, the decision to respond to evil with healing rather than harm, to break the cycle of violence rather than perpetuate it. Catherine would spend the rest of her life paying for her crimes, but I refused to spend mine being poisoned by hatred. After my presentation, a young resident approached me with tears in her eyes. My father was murdered when I was 16. For years, I've been consumed by anger, by thoughts of revenge. Your story, it shows me there's another way. Those conversations happened everywhere I spoke, with victims' families, with medical professionals, with people struggling to find meaning in senseless loss. Each time I was reminded that choosing healing over harm wasn't just about Catherine or even about me. It was about refusing to let evil define the boundaries of our humanity. Standing in my father's garden tonight, watching the roses he'd once used for his experiments bloom in the California twilight, I finally understood what he'd been trying to teach me all those years ago when he chose love over vengeance, even as Catherine slowly killed him. Love doesn't mean enabling evil. Sometimes love means holding people accountable for their choices, even when it breaks your heart. Sometimes love means choosing to heal when everything inside you screams for revenge. Justice isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that truth prevailed, that the guilty faced consequences, and that you chose to build something beautiful from the ashes of something terrible. Detective Torres calls occasionally to update me on Catherine's appeals, all of which have been denied. Grace sends photos of the children visiting our educational programs. Daniel shares news of families we've helped, lives we've saved with research born from tragedy. I'm Dr. Liza Smith, and I chose to save the woman who tried to kill me, not for her sake, but for mine. Because that's who I decided to become, someone who uses knowledge to preserve life even when that life belongs to someone who doesn't deserve preservation. In the end, that choice didn't just save Catherine's life, it saved my soul and gave meaning to my father's death. That's the thing about choosing healing over harm. It transforms everyone it touches, including the person making the choice. And that transformation? That's the real antidote to poison.
Liza, I know you won't believe this, but I've been thinking about what you said in court, about accountability, about facing consequences. The prison chancellor says I need to understand the full scope of what I did, not just the murders, but the emotional damage. I want you to know that I understand now what I took from you, not just your father, but your sense of safety, your ability to trust your own family. I stole 15 years of peace from you, made you question your own memories and instincts. I can't give those back, but I wanted you to know that I see it now. That's not an apology. I don't deserve to apologize, and you don't owe me forgiveness. It's just acknowledgement. Catherine. I read it twice, then filed it away without responding. Some acknowledgments don't require answers, and some bridges are meant to stay burned. Catherine's letter showed growth, perhaps, but it didn't change the fundamental truth. She'd murdered my father and tried to murder me. Understanding her guilt didn't erase it. That same week, Benjamin called with news that made filing that letter feel like the right choice. Our latest research had led to successful treatment of 18 poisoning victims in Syria, where chemical weapons had contaminated water supplies.
Children were alive because we'd chosen to transform Catherine's weapon into medicine. The WHO is requesting our protocols for their emergency response teams, he said, excitement crackling through the international connection. Liza, we're not just saving individual lives anymore. We're building global capacity to respond to chemical terrorism. Dad would be proud, I said, though I think he would be proudest of the choice I made that night in his study. Not the scientific achievement or the lives saved afterward, but the moment I decided that healing mattered more than hatred. Grace found me in the garden that evening, tending to Dad's experimental roses. At 72, she moved more slowly, but her eyes still held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd survived by watching, by understanding the unspoken currents that flow beneath family life. "You read her letter," she observed, settling beside me on the wooden bench Dad had built 30 years ago. "How did you know?" "You have that look, like you're processing something bitter but necessary." Grace's weathered hands were gentle as she helped me deadhead the roses. What did she say? That she understands what she took from us. From me specifically. Do you believe her? I considered this while examining a particularly stubborn bloom that refused to release its spent petals. I believe she's trying to understand. Whether she succeeds isn't my responsibility anymore. My responsibility is to keep building something good from the wreckage she left behind. Grace nodded approvingly. Your father used to say that forgiveness was like pruning roses. Sometimes you have to cut away the dead parts so the living parts can flourish, but he never said you had to keep the dead parts around. That night, I stood in Dad's old laboratory, now humming with research that would help people he'd never meet. On the wall hung a photo from last month's International Victims Conference. 37 families whose loved ones had survived poisoning because of antidotes we'd developed. Their faces showed the kind of gratitude that transforms grief into purpose. I thought about the girl I'd been 2 years ago, arriving at this house with trembling hands and a metallic taste in her mouth, convinced she was losing her mind. She couldn't have imagined that her mother's attempt to destroy her would lead to this, a foundation that had helped over 300 poisoning victims worldwide, research that had advanced the field of toxicology by decades, and a peace that came not from forgetting the past, but from transforming it. The poison is gone from my system now, neutralized by the antidote I synthesized in desperation and rage. But the immunity I built, the knowledge, the strength, the absolute certainty that I will always choose healing over harm, that immunity is permanent and transferable. Every person we've helped carries a piece of it forward. Sometimes people ask if I regret saving Catherine's life. The question always surprises me because it assumes the choice was about her. It wasn't. It was about who I decided to become in the moment when everything I believed about family and love and justice was burning down around me. I chose to be someone who heals, even when healing hurts, even when it would be easier to let the poison do its work. That choice saved more than Catherine's life. It saved mine too, and created ripples of healing that continue to spread across the world. And in the end, that's the most powerful antidote of all. The decision to become the person your trauma couldn't destroy, to build something beautiful from the wreckage she left behind, to choose light even when everything around you is darkness. I'm Dr. Liza Smith, and this is my story. Thank you for listening. And remember, if you're facing your own kind of poison, whether it's family betrayal or any other trauma, you always have a choice about who you become next. Choose healing. Choose growth. Choose to be the antidote the world needs. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.